I want to thank the group once again for inviting me to speak to you tonight. This time we'll be discussing ram selection, which given the time of year, I think it's very appropriate. Whereas some of you might have already started your breeding program, but we are certainly approaching it fairly quickly. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Next slide. Okay, so as with any breeding program, the first thing you need to do is set up some goals. Now, if you are really just wanting to put lambs on the ground, maybe get a wool crop every year, any fertile ram will do. That said, it kind of increases your risk, right? Because you don't really know what you're getting in terms of, say, wool quality, for example, or number of lambs, or even if he's fertile. So yes, you can buy them fairly inexpensively, but for the purpose of this talk, we're going to hopefully want to improve our productivity, meaning you're going to get more information, or you're going to want to gather more information. So you do have some homework to do. You might end up paying a little more for these animals, but at the end of the day, you're reducing your risk, and that additional investment should improve your income. So it should be profitable. Okay, next slide. All right, so we've got a basic outline. We'll go into a little bit of everything on this list, but why selecting the right ram is important. Next slide. So one thing we know is that you can make genetic progress fairly quickly by finding that ideal mate for your ewes. There's a direct correlation between ram selection and productivity, because if you think about it, your ewes kind of drive your general selection, but the rams cover up to 30 ewes. So they really have a fairly substantial influence on the genetics of your offspring. Next slide. So this just kind of shows the correlation if you pick the right ram versus the wrong ram. Ram performance is going to probably exceed your average if you find the right ones, but he will increase the average overall of your flock. Where if you use sort of a moderate to low performing ram, you get kind of the opposite result. You kind of bring down the productivity of that flock. And in this case, it's fleece weight. So there's a very strong correlation between the two. Next slide. So the potential rams can bring to meet your breeding objective. The breeding objective is effectively the same thing as your production goals. So that's one thing to think about. And it does require kind of making a list, and that helps you focus on the traits that you want to look for when you're selecting rams. Next slide. So that list can include anything from increasing weaning weights to lambing rates, meaning, you want multiples, or just healthier, more vigorous lambs. You want to improve your wool quality because you're finding a market for that wool. Improving marketability of those lambs, meaning their growth is quite well and they have good muscling. Or you're in a situation, and that's why I put the picture of the Dorpers here, is reduce the need for shearing. Sometimes finding those guys to even shear sheep is getting harder and harder to do. And these haired sheep have a pretty strong market. We did a marketing symposium. This has been a couple of years back now, but the guy out at trying to blank on the sale barn, it's fairly big in Texas, said the majority of the market lambs going through there are haired sheep or of this Dorper breed. So they still hold their value. It's just you won't have that wool as a second product. Or are you wanting to get into the club market? Club lamb market, that's a kind of a different animal altogether. But all of these can lead towards your ram selection decisions. Next slide. So where are sheep genetics headed? So you have that breeding objective, and does it align with the commercial objectives or with industry trends, right? So he has certain abilities to do certain things, and does that fit your goals? So that's the first question to think about. And if he does not, then at that point, you consider changing rams. So look at the rams you have right now, look at the production of your flock or your herd, and then you can kind of decide, is it time to change? And sometimes it's time to change simply to mix up the genetics, get a little more vigor in your herd or in your lambs. And so keeping good records is also helpful in knowing when to change out rams. So industry trends are pretty similar than what to be expected. Oh, can you back up a bit? Sorry. So industry trends, obviously we want to maximize reproduction for profitability's sake, but you also want to improve the gain and efficiency of those lambs. Getting more off of the same amount of land is absolutely critical these days. And so through genetic selection, you can get that done, improve your wool quality and production overall. And then something else that's been a focus of the last several years is parasite resistance. We know that sheep in particular have become resistant to wormers. They don't work, they're not as effective depending on your worming program. Now in the desert Southwest, we're a little bit of an advantage because we don't have the parasite loads that say Southeastern people do, but nevertheless, this is actually a genetic trait that can be selected for if you're wanting to improve on that. Okay, now next slide. How likely is the ram going to help you progress? How are rams selected for use? What's the selection differential? And basically what that means is the ram has X performance and it may be below, but it's more than likely above the herd average of what you're doing right now. And that is what's called the selection differential. And keep in mind though, what are the genetics that the ewes are providing? And so if you want to improve on those averages, that's where you want to find these superior rams. And then keep in mind that ram can really help quite quickly improve this progress simply because he will be covering hopefully at least 30 ewes. So next slide. So how are rams selected for use? Oops, sorry, I didn't fix that title. So basically, the sheep industry is a little bit, for lack of a better term, behind other animal agriculture industries in genetic selection. They are now, in the last maybe 10 or so years, starting to develop selection criteria that can be measured and given values, similar to EPDs in the cattle industry. And these values are called EBVs, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They also now have selection indexes, which basically is a single number that represents multiple traits that you can also look for depending on your production goals. So that the sheep industry, for whatever reason, is a little bit behind in the regard of this toolbox, or this tool that you can have in your selection toolbox. But it's there, it's being developed, and hopefully you'll learn a little more about that tonight. Next slide. Okay, so EBV is estimated breeding value, and basically it's the genetic potential of performance of the offspring from specific animals. In this case, we're talking about rams and what their offspring can do. Like I said, very similar to EPDs. And we know that we've had EPDs in the cattle industry for over 40 years, and we've made tremendous progress. So we know this tool works. And so hopefully this is more available to all sheep producers, that they can start utilizing it for their own selection purposes. And so next slide, we can kind of go through an example. So this is a lot of numbers, and I'll try and walk through this. Without a pointer, it's kind of hard, but the far left column with all the big numbers, that's the animal. And then on the top row is the individual estimated breeding values, and their acronyms, very similar to EPDs in cattle, if you're familiar with that. BWT is birth weight, WWT is weaning weight, mature weaning weight, or maternal weaning weight, paternal weaning weight, yearling weight. And then this WFEC is that fecal count. So that is the parasite load or resistance to parasites value. And you want a very negative number here, right? You want a low number with this particular EPD, but you can also have some carcass values in that PFAT. And then NLB is number of lambs born. So that's an indication of fertility. This US hair index, you want a very high number there, and that represents all of the components and characteristics of wool. I'm sorry, of performance, my bad. Okay, so next slide. So what goes into an estimated breeding value? It's a combination of heritability of a trait, animal's actual performance, right? So very similar to other genetic measures. The producers of these purebred animals have to report birth weights and weaning weights and yearling weights and so on, wool quality and the like. Relatives information, so that would be the pedigrees. And then adjustments for environment, which is very important when it comes to selection. Next slide. So how do we know EBVs are better than raw measurements? Well, it's an added to. Certainly when you have the actual information of that animal, either you're looking at them or you're reading how they gained or what their wool quality is, that's certainly helpful. But the EBVs add that genetic component that you can't see, and the other factors, right? The pedigrees, what animals are these out of, and how does that compare to the breed average and that kind of thing. So we know through previous work that breeders are achieving about a 4% gain overall in performance, which is over time going to be very significant. And if you're wanting to learn more about specific EBVs, like I talked about, or specific traits, the development of this program, of this EBV system, started with the National Sheep Improvement Program. Here is a link to the organization itself, or you can just Google NSIP and then have sheep in there somewhere, and it will take you to their website as a resource, and it's pretty informative if you're wanting to do a little more digging on using EBVs in your selection process. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about specific traits and what the acronyms are, and then what kind of numbers you'd want to look for as it relates to reproduction, birth weight, maternal birth weight, number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned, scrotal circumference in the ram, and then that worm egg count I have for reproduction. But really that's just sort of it for your replacement purposes. You certainly want to keep females that have a good worm egg count value. Now again, for birth weight and the worm egg count, you want negative or low numbers. And then for the others, you're looking for very positive numbers, right? So scrotal circumference is related to reproduction, both for if you do raise purebred animals or seed stock animals. It's directly correlated to scrotal circumference of ram offspring, but it can also be related somewhat to fertility in the ewes. So next slide. Next, we have growth. So if really your focus is on improving your rate of gain while you have the lambs, weaning weight is certainly one. But post-weaning gains and yearling weight, I like to look at simply because there's less noise, if you will, in these values. They're more heritable. And so it is, if you get a higher post-weaning gait value, that's likely going to correlate with a heavier lamb at weaning. And so, of course, you want higher values there. That fat depth and loin eye muscle, these are your carcass. And so, again, the loin eye muscle will also be an indication of growth just because they're going to have a lot of muscle, and muscle is heavier than fat. And you're looking for lean, so you're wanting a more negative number on your fat depth. Next slide. So wool has a bunch of, all the characteristics are considered, and some are more heritable than others. Fleece weight's fairly heritable. Staple length is very heritable, but then you've got some like variation and curvature, which are a little less heritable. But these kind of show you what you're looking for and what the acronyms for are for those EBVs, with GFW being greased fleece weight, FD fiber diameter, SL staple length, fiber diameter coefficient of variation, which is important. You don't want a lot of variation within the fleece. And then fiber curvature is kind of your crimp. And so again, you'll see pluses and minuses as the numbers you would want to look for to evaluate the ram's wool quality potential. Next slide. But it all comes down to heritability. In order to make real progress, you want to find the traits that are highly heritable. And when I say highly heritable, that means you have a 30% chance or greater of passing that particular trait on. And it has, the environment itself has minimal effects, or management has minimal effects for the outcome of that genetic expression. So phenotypic traits are those that are things that can be measured, right? Weaning weight, birth weight, things that can be seen. And that's how you can kind of measure that. And the more heritable the trait, the quicker you'll have for rate of improvement on that particular trait, okay? Next slide. Oh, yeah, so that's the thing. So you make your list of traits and then that you want, but then you've got to have a good understanding of what your chances are of actually improving that trait based on the heritability of it. Okay, sorry, next trait, next slide. So here's sort of a breakdown in sheep on heritability based on traits. So reproduction is probably one of the lowest heritable traits across any animal production system. There's too much involved as it relates to environment that can impact reproduction, and management can certainly impact this. Breed will impact this. And so it's really hard to make significant improvements in reproduction through selection alone. This improvement primarily comes from management and good culling criteria. Growth, on the other hand, you have a little more opportunity for success. It's low to moderate. Weaning weights are a little bit lower simply because you do have a more environmental impact, right? So say we go through the drought like we did this year, those ewes aren't going to milk as strong as they normally would, and that's certainly going to impact your weaning weight, right? So genetic expression is a little bit suppressed because of poor environment, and that's why it's on the low end. Where you have your post-weaning gains, or that it's just typically going to, hold on, I'm getting a phone call, I'm trying to stop. Okay, so growth is has less to do with mom's situation and more to do with the animal itself, and that's why it's a little more heritable. Carcass is more heritable still because of the fact that the genetics drive that so much more than environment. So highly heritable on your carcass if you're looking to improve on that. Fleece is moderate to high, again, depending on the characteristic we're looking at. Staple length, pretty heritable. Fleece weight, fairly heritable. The others sort of fall off from there. Again, it depends on nutrition and environment. If you are raising dairy, sheep for predominantly dairy, very high, right? So we have Holsteins, they're cows, and they are known for producing milk. We have certain goats that are known for producing milk. We have high producing sheep. So again, pretty heritable based on breed. And then something to think about too, if you focus too much on one trait, you're ultimately going to give up another. So you do want to carry a fine balance the best that you can. For example, if you select just for growth and carcass, you're likely going to give up wool quality and reproduction a little bit. So you want to kind of pay attention if you're if you're doing dual purpose, right, for meat and wool. You kind of want to keep both of those traits in check. Okay, next slide. The difference between performance and the group is that's the selection differential we talked about. And we're going to show you examples of that. Wool quality, again, moderate heritability to high is 35% is pretty good, where weaning weights are a little bit lower, again, because of the environment. Next slide. Okay, so here's a kind of an example. You've got dam C and sire D. So this is where you can find differences with the right sire. That mating generated weaning weights of 60 pounds, where dam E crossed with sire D, or dam E crossed with sire D, same sire, different, or same ram, different ewes. I can't really talk. You get a weaning weight of 25 pounds more. So why is that? That's probably coming from a combination of the fact that she's a higher producer, but he's still a higher producer as well, and that will give you a 20% advantage in that situation. So the sire, or the dam, I don't like it called sire, the ram, it's been a long day. The ram can have a pretty significant impact on weaning weights, but the ewe does play a role. It's a 50-50 deal, right? So something to think about. And again, good records will help you make those decisions on who's your higher producing ewes to maximize the use of those higher producing rams. Next slide. As it reflects on wool quality, for example, say your average micron measurement, that's the diameter of that fiber, is 21 microns, which is really pretty fine. Okay, that's not a terrible wool quality. It's actually pretty decent, but you're wanting to go finer still because you have a premium market for that, and that's your goal. And so you find rams that are exceptional in this area that are 17 microns is what his potential is. And so by crossing him on to your herd that's already pretty good, you're still going to get a bump in production or improvement in wool quality, clear over to 18 microns and so your average will go from 21 microns over time down to 18 microns, meaning the whole flock that has been covered by this particular ram will have much better wool quality in their offspring. I'm hoping that makes sense. Okay, next slide. So obviously this is one of the key things to look at, and probably the easiest and most accessible pieces of information for you when you're selecting rams is structure. To put eyes on these animals is critically important because it is fairly heritable. What you see is what you may get in the offspring, right? So you're looking, regardless if you are looking for a wool quality or dual purpose animal, thick muscle is always the goal. You want something that's balanced in structure. Length of skeleton, you want him long-bodied. Now I put a question mark on frame. He has to fit your environment. If you're familiar with the Colombian breed, they were generated out of Wyoming. These things are little horses. They're quite big. They've got a lot of frame. However, they were bred for that rough sagebrush country up there, and they do pretty well. They normally have singles, which helps that situation. But if you're looking for multiples and you're in pretty, drought prone areas, you may want to make that decision based on, can he survive and create offspring that can survive in your environment. Again, scrotal circumference really key in this particular selection process, because scrotal circumference in the ram itself is directly correlated with fertility of that ram. And so, you do, from that standpoint, want to see that he is well endowed, and that that is a correlation for his age for fertility. And then again, wool quality is something you can actually measure. You can send samples off to the lab, which I'm going to discuss in a minute. So you know exactly kind of where he's at on the quality range, if that's going to be part of your program. Next slide. So this is just some common feet and leg that you're looking for with rams, and certainly bone circumference is important. You don't want them too fine boned, but you want them straight, because crooked begets crooked. So if you have a severely cow-hocked or camped in hind set, he may not last quite as long in rugged country, but he's going to pass that trait along very likely. So you do want to look for straight, and then the side view that he's straight from the legs too, from hocks to on down. There's not a lot of angle there, and then from the back end again, the cow hocked versus bow-legged versus straight. You kind of want to make sure he's going to withstand that rough country. Next slide. So here's a slide and I'm working on a publication now on wool quality and kind of how to wrap your head around that. So what we did is we took 2 samples from 2 rams here at New Mexico State University's sheep unit, West Sheep Unit. And the main goal was to see variation between where that sample was taken, but also between lambs. These were, I don't know if they were yearlings. They might have been I think they were mature rams. And so you can see ram 009 had a micron value of 21, and ram 818 had micron of 22.9. So a little coarser. And then if you just take them clear across this this table, what I look for too is he had low variation, and then that CF is the comfort factor, and he was a little higher in the comfort factor. And so overall, if I were to want to focus on improving wool quality, and I had just one ram to pick from, I would pick 09 over 18, as I think he would give me more progress in that regard. Next slide. Something else to really look out for, and this is not only in your rams, but in your offspring and in your ewes, are malformations, or when breeding goes wrong. And there's multiple issues with sheep that can happen. Jaw malformations, pretty heritable, and whether they're parrot mouth or they're undershot, bulldog mouth as they call it, they can't eat very well. And so long term, these animals aren't going to last. They might make it through the feeding process as a young animal, but beyond that, they should not be kept as replacements. And then inverted eyelids are also fairly common, and they can be problematic if not addressed. In that particular picture, they've put a little staple to bring that third eyelid down and open it back up. But again, pretty heritable and can cause a lot of irritation and eventually blindness if not really handled well. And so definitely cull any ewe lambs that you would have thought of keeping, even if they're out of the best ewes and best rams. Any malformations you want to get rid of, and then make note. Sometimes it's just a fluke and it was a random recessive gene that got in there. But you do need, it's not necessarily a death sentence for that ewe or for that ram, but you definitely need to be watchful of it that next year around to see that that doesn't crop up again. Yes, the PowerPoint can be sent out. Okay. And then the final thing that's very important and that isn't done nearly enough in our industry, we take advantage, and we do it in our bulls, we do not do it in our rams. And we really need to do a breed soundness exam in our rams every year, and particularly when purchasing, to make sure that they are fertile and ready for breeding. This would be done probably a month ago or so, just to see, or whenever you buy the new animal, just to see that they are ready for breeding. Talk to your veterinarian to see that they have the equipment and the ability to do so. And then, is he healthy? Can you get a health background of these animals? If possible, a reputable breeder will provide that information to you. And then that can give you an idea of potentially maybe what his offspring may do as well. And disposition, these guys can get a little bit aggressive, particularly during breeding season. And so this is kind of heritable. And one of the challenges, it's not as big an issue in the sheep industry, I don't think, but really, if you have high-strung animals, whether they be ewes or rams, that makes their offspring high-strung, and then that ultimately impacts reproduction if they're replacement ewes, performance if they're feedlot animals. And so it just has a negative consequence all around. So be mindful of disposition. Next slide. And like I said, he really needs to fit, right? The picture on the left, lush green pastures, is not something we're very used to very often. We're more used to what's going on the right. And so we got to make sure, we want to set him up for success. We don't want to buy some fancy animal from Missouri and kick him out into this country and expect him to do well, because he will not. He will lose sufficient amount of body weight and probably libido and not cover as many ewes as he's supposed to. He may lose fertility. So you do want to buy from folks that have like environments. They don't have to be the same. They don't have to be your neighbor. But we don't want to shock their system too much. Now, if you're having challenges finding rams, which I know a lot of people can at times, if you buy those rams on the younger end, give them time to acclimate before you ask them to breed ewes. That could be a way that you could go farther than the borders of, say, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and be successful with your ram purchases. But you'd want to look for a younger animal that has time to adapt. Next slide. This is a long list, but it's really important. Records, records, records. So we gave you the genetic component, number of lambs, all that you can look at your estimated breeding values and say, well, he should do this, but the records would tell you if he is doing that, right? So it's a two-way street. Ewes have to hold up their end of the bargain, but the only way you know you're making progress is to measure it. And so write down the number of lambs per ewe, right? This is for each animal. And lamb health, weaning weights, lamb mortality, not due to predation, right? If she just continually has sick, poor doing lambs, or she's not a good mother, whatever the case may be, these notes need to be written down for tightening up the reproduction and the maternal side of your herd, to make them a little more efficient. Keep track of your fleece weights, realizing that can all change year to year. Nutrition kind of has a role in that a little bit, but genetics will trump that if given the opportunity. Fleece quality, is that starting to change? And then certainly the rate of gain. If you're able to keep your lambs through the feeding stage and even get carcass data back, sometimes that's a good way to fully measure your whole program, realizing that's not realistic in some cases. But if you're in a situation that say you are going to feed a few lambs out, keep track of how they do, and then get the carcass data back and see how they do there. Okay, next slide. So in summary, what are your production goals? You start that before you go out to look for purchasing a ram. You want to fine tune that. That makes your job a little easier once you decided what those goals are. Will it fit your resources? Make sure you're setting him up for success. Go ahead. Are they readily available, right? So bringing in an exotic is a neat idea, but sometimes those breed associations or those breeders are few and far between, and you want to have fairly steady source of a good quality ram base. Next slide. Take advantage of their assets, right? So know what they potentially will bring and measure it. That way you'll know that he is in fact, that selection differential that I spoke of is in fact benefiting you and that you are profiting from it. I think that's it. Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you for your patience. And again, sorry for the technical difficulties. I can provide this and will provide this PowerPoint. You'll have that as a resource. So, but any questions, we'll be happy to answer.
Feel free to unmute yourself, or you can go ahead and type your question into the chat box.
Good evening. So you mentioned carcass quality. Does it have to? I have some sheep that are going in for butcher in a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately here in the Farmington area, I don't have a USDA registered butcher. Is it just the USDA that would give me the carcass quality? Or I could just ask.
So one of the things, right, that's a good question. I think for the general information that would be of benefit to you, they have yield grades that are a little different than beef through the USDA grading system, but information for just a custom processing, if they can, they should be able to give you the hanging carcass weight. And from there, you can kind of get an idea of what their dressing percent was and see if there's any differences there. And then you can physically measure the loini and compare just for your own reference. And that would give you an idea of muscle tone and thickness. But the data specific, is generally generated from a grader that as far as specifics on quality, but there's little bits of information that are still beneficial to you on those custom kills. Like I said, the carcass weight, carcass yield, and then muscle depth or muscle loin eye area. So those are things that you could physically measure yourself when you get the packages back. So
Okay, thank you.
yeah, and then, if you're feeding these guys out, right? So say you have 4 lambs that you're feeding out to, and you can just as your own little experiment, like see which one gained better and which one kind of was heavier when you took him in, and did he take more feed than the others or less feed? And do it at your scale versus a larger scale. And that can be just as informative too. So
I do have a question. I know that in one of your charts, you did mention something about fiber in the wool. Why is that like on the side of the chart saying that it was like negative that has to stay below?
was that so you don't want a lot of fiber, yeah, right? You don't want the hair, right? So you're looking for a negative number there. As far as I understand, when they build these estimated breeding values for things like that, they take the sample from the same location, and again, breed is really going to dictate that number a lot. And so that's something that would change that number. And then the pedigree, I think, would have some influence on that as well. So yeah, the reason you're wanting to look for negative numbers, for wool quality, it's undesirable. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
I have
Go ahead.
Marcy, you mentioned that we should have the ram tested. What was that test called that I would ask my veterinarian?
A breed soundness exam, and BSE. And what they do, it's a fertility test or fertility testing, and they have to have special equipment, and not all veterinarians have it for sheep. I wish they did, because I think a lot of rams are out there that are not fertile, and you don't really know or find out until you're in a situation where you're down to say 1 ram, right? And you only get 50% lamb crop or something terrible. So it should be done prior to your breeding season. And what they do is they do a physical exam. They'll measure motility, concentration, and the morphology or the shape of the sperm cells under a microscope. And then they can tell you that, yes, he's ready for breeding. Younger, like yearling rams, typically don't test all that well. This is something that grows over time. But a veterinarian that's done this can tell you that he still has potential to breed. So these yearling rams, just keep in mind that they may not cover as many ewes as, say, a mature ram would, just because they don't know what's going on, and they're probably not quite as fertile as matures. So, but definitely, like I said, I hope there's someone out there in your region that has the equipment to do rams, because it does require like a special probe and that, but it's critically important that they can do that. Just from a money standpoint, from a efficiency standpoint, you certainly don't want to feed a ram for a year that's not going to produce, right?
Okay. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and open up for another question. If there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and move on. So like I said, you are more than welcome to unmute yourself, or better yet, you can go ahead and insert your question in the chat. Okay. All right. Well, that concludes our webinar for today. So thank you, Marcy, for providing us such an informative presentation as you always do. So thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule for educating us on RAM selection. So, well, this will be the end of it, and we'll go on to our announcements. Just to let you guys know, I did send out our polls. So only one response that I have seen. So if you could take the time, just take 1 minute and fill out the poll survey. And while you do that, I'll go ahead and discuss our announcements. So just to let you guys know, on October 17th, we do have a presentation on Drought Talk and Seasonal Outlook webinar that will be presented by Dr. Erin Saffel. She's the Arizona State climatologist, and the time will always be 5:30 p.m. through 6:30 p.m. We're still waiting on a confirmation for our next week webinar, so we'll keep you guys posted. And like we have mentioned, like us on Facebook, we do have a YouTube channel where all of our webinar are transferred over to our YouTube page. So they're there for you if you want to go back on one particular section that you wanted to get more in depth on. So you're more than welcome to. We do have monthly newsletters that go out every month. So if that is all, we'll go ahead and end it. Oh, and just to remind you all, our Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project webinar has transitioned to a different webinar, or sorry, website link. So it is no longer nsaproject.nmsu.edu. Now it is nsa.nmsu.edu. So you'll find all up-to-date events that will be taking place for this month, including our PowerPoint and information. And I needed to go on here to see who needed a copy of the presentation. Okay. All right. I have a good idea who wants a copy of the PowerPoint slides. All right. So I'll go ahead and send that out to you. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully we see you guys all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project is a New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service initiative delivered in collaboration with two of our partners, Dene College Land Grant Office and COPE, which stands for Community Outreach and Patient Empowerment. Our project is funded by the USDA Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers and Benefited Farmers and Ranchers program. So what that abbreviates to is OASDVFR. As our project, we improve the operations, profitability, and sustainability of socially disadvantaged Navajo farmers and ranchers and veteran farmers and ranchers. We also encourage our producers to increase their knowledge in the use of USDA programs, and those USDA programs include NRCS, FSA, RD, and RMA, and services, and those of other research providers. And that would include the Department of Agriculture from Navajo Nation, Department of Ag. So sorry about that, but we also increase local production and consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables and healthy food by Navajo families and individuals. So that pretty much wraps up of who we are as a project.